Our third keynote speaker of today is Ernst Schraube. Ernst Schraube is one of the core organizers of this event and professor of social psychology of technology in the Department of People and Technology at Roskilde University. Ernst researches the social and political implications of modern technology in everyday life. And he does so with the standpoint of the subject as his epistemological lens. Ernst is an expert on critical psychology, specifically, but surely not limited to, the writings of Klaus Holzkamp. Ernst is also one of the leading experts on the philosophy and writings of Günther Anders. It's this unique combination that allows him a unique perspective that he will now share with us in a talk entitled Learning and the Politics of Digitalization, Rethinking the Practices of Knowing in Times of Crisis. Ernst, the floor is yours.
I'm very happy we have this conference and that scholars, also from within psychology, take the problems of our time seriously and think together about the crisis we are confronted with in our world today. In a way, the crises require a rethinking of psychology as a science. We are used to analyze the phenomena in isolation, in the laboratory, in controlled and artificial settings. Such an epistemic practice has its strengths. However, our contemporary problems and crises require more. A move into the everyday world and an understanding of the phenomena in their worldly connections. A move from a disembodied to an embodied psychological theory, methodology, and research practice. As Jürgen Habermas recently nicely formulated, the problem of modern science is that we learn more and more about less and less without clarifying what it means for us. Accordingly, Donna Haraway argues in her plea for staying with the trouble for a tentacular thinking, tentaculars, the arms of an octopus. Actually, throughout the history of psychology, we can find approaches contributing to tentacular thinking and embodied practices of developing knowledge. William Stern, for example, one of the most distinguished German psychologists at the beginning of the last century, and a father of the psychology of everyday life, argued for psychological analysis as synthesis, as tracing psychological phenomena in their worldly connections. And during the past 3-4 decades, a multitude of alternative psychological approaches emerged, engaged in developing a vocabulary which enables us to understand psychological phenomena in their internal relationship and connection with the natural, social, discursive, cultural, and technological world. I'm drawing on these traditions and focus today on learning and digitalization. The crises and problems in our contemporary world represent quite a challenge for human learning. They require expansive learning, and furthermore, I would say they require that we fundamentally rethink our understanding of learning. From transmission of knowledge towards learning as a worlding practice. Learning does not happen as a process of transmitting knowledge into the brain. On the contrary, it is an activity connecting us with the world, initiated by the problems, conflicts, and crises we experience in our everyday life. In relation to learning, a key question today is in which ways digital devices, systems, and platforms, just like these which enable that we are meeting here, actually can facilitate our learning activities and tentacular thinking. are not. There are many hopes that after the corona crisis, online learning will be the future. Yes, the digital devices give possibilities to expand our learning. However, they are not just paradise. They give new possibilities, but also limitations and restraints. And they involve a few serious traps. The digitalization of educational practice can revitalize the transfer model of teaching and learning, and it can undermine key modes of the act of learning. It is a good idea to include digital technologies in certain activities of the learning process. It's good that we can meet here in digital space and exchange and discuss our thoughts. However, the possibility of unfolding expansive learning and tentacular thinking requires also digital confinement. That's the argument of my talk. Here, the overview. Step 1, it's about learning and how to rethink learning from the transmission model towards learning as a world-end practice rooted in the conduct of everyday life. Step 2 is about digital technologies, from means to an end towards technologies as materialized action and political forms of life. And step 3 explains the dialectics of digital connectedness and why digital confinement matters. Now, step 1. Rethinking learning. Even if nobody any longer explicitly argues for it, the transmission or internalization model of learning is still in our minds. Learning is understood as a transfer of knowledge from a teacher to a learner, where the content of learning is predefined by the teacher. What a teacher teaches is what a learner learns. After the corona lockdown, I hear quite a few colleagues at universities saying, online teaching? No problem. With these digital devices and platforms, I can transmit knowledge much more effectively than face to face. The problem with the transmission model is that it identifies the activity of teaching with the activity of learning. A teaching-learning short circuit, as Klaus Hoskamp describes it, which systematically disarticulates the subjectivity of the learner. Learning, however, is an activity of the learner, which does not mean that teachers are irrelevant. Therefore, in response to the limits of the transmission model, the model of student-centered learning became influential during the past years. Within the European Union, the ministers of higher education agreed that this model is the future to work with in educational practice. The model of student-centered learning has its strength. It reflects on the importance of the subjectivity of the learners and that learning requires participation and influence of the learners on the learning process and learning context. However, until now, within the model, participation and influence is reduced to the learning method, the how of learning. In contrast, the what of learning, the learning content, remains predefined by the teacher. Athanasios Mavakis, who is also presenting here at the conference, and myself are describing such a systematic separation and dichotomy of the content and method of learning as bisected learning. Drawing on John Dewey and others, we argue that If the learner cannot participate in defining both the what and how of learning, it seriously hinders the learning process and the possibility of unfolding the full potential of human learning, something we can no longer afford in these times of global crisis. The learning content, the problems, questions, crises experienced in everyday life are key for any learning activity. They initiate the learning process and bring it into motion. Learning is a practice trying to understand problems, dilemmas, crises, and to expand human agency in the internal relationship with the world. We can therefore speak of learning as a problem-oriented, participatory, and dialogical worlding practice. Understanding learning as an activity of the learners opens up the view that learning is not just a worlding practice, but also requires a particular practice of learning. Learning is not just an individual activity, internalizing stuff into the brain. It is always a situated activity, happening in specific time and space, in specific situations, contexts, and environments. With the concept practice of learning, I would like to bring this spatio-temporal situatedness of the learning activity in concrete practical learning contexts into the view. The learning activity develops in and through specific practices of learning, and they are therefore of crucial importance for the way how the act of learning can unfold. A specific practice of learning, for example, is this room here in which I am sitting, with my chair, table, books, computer, virtual connection to you. The practices of learning are arranged by the learner as well as others. It is a socio-material arrangement. And it is a good idea to take the learning content, the learning problem, as the basic principle to arrange and structure the practice of learning. Learning to windsurf, for example, requires another learning practice than learning to play piano, or learning about psychology of global crisis in times of social distancing and extensive lockdown. Just one more little differentiation. We learn not just in one practice of learning, but in and across different practices. At home, at a seminar, at the university, together with friends, maybe even at a virtual conference. And our learning happens in and across these various practices of learning. Ole Dreyer describes that as trajectories of learning, as lines of inquiry which move across contexts. Now, today, digital technologies are an elementary part of our practices of learning. Computers, mobile phones, digital platforms and fora, Google, YouTube videos, Slack, and so forth. Digital devices are embodied in the learning practices, and from here they attain their significance. However, they do not just determine the practice of learning. We can relate to the devices, involve them in our learning process, or put them aside. More about it in a second. That's why it is a good idea to take a closer look on digital technologies and their significance in the practice of learning. Step 2. Digital technologies. From means to an end towards technologies as materialized action and political forms of life. Often, even in critical thought, digital technologies are understood as means to an end, as neutral tools or instruments Decisive is only what we do with them in individual or collective action. A computer, for example, is seen as a means to the end of writing a text. Such an instrumental notion points to an important insight. Human action and the learning activity of the learners are not causally determined by digital technologies. Rather, there is a possibility to relate to the devices and to involve them in the learning activity for self-determined purposes. But no means are just means. The means to an end notion of digital devices remains one-sided and reductive, because not only the learners do something with the digital devices, but the digital devices also do something with the learners. To stay with the example, as soon as I have chosen a pen or a computer as my writing device, basic pre-decisions about the writing activity have been made, which cannot be revised anymore during the writing process. Technologies represent pre-decisions, as the philosopher of technology Günther Anders describes, which embody, as I would say, materialized action. They are contradictory forms of life, as Langton Winner, who is also presenting here at the conference, explained more than 30 years ago. Forms of life which are inherently political. Therefore, it is a good idea to be aware of what digital technologies do and what kind of political action, politics and action they embody. Now, what do the digital technologies do in relation to the practice of learning? Step 3. The dialectics of digital connectedness and why digital confinement matters. They put us in an historical new relationship, a fundamentally new form of connection between human subject and the world. Radio and TV brought the world into the home of the individual subject. Digital technologies bring the world into the homes, but also connect the homes with the world. My home here is suddenly connected with your home. You can see me and my home. I cannot see you, but my voice enters your home. In relation to the practice of learning, this new form of digital connectedness transforms fundamentally the possibilities of participation. And these new emerging forms of digital connectedness and participation are deeply contradictory and political. Just a few examples. The new form of digital connectedness expands our possibility to connect to and to participate in the world. It expands the possibility of social connection with people around the world, such as we do here at the conference. In a similar way, it expands our access to knowledge, to books, archives, and many kinds of learning materials. Digital connectedness gives indeed the possibility of a more free, open, participatory, and democratic way of accessing and developing knowledge. The digital infrastructure, therefore, offers important elements to expand our practices of learning. However, digital connectedness expands also the possibilities that the world can connect to and participate in our home, in our everyday life, and our practices of learning. Shoshana Zuboff, for example, describes in her book on surveillance capitalism how the big tech companies like Google, Amazon, and Facebook are entering our homes and are appropriating, as she writes, our everyday experience as raw material. As soon as we are opening our computer and search for literature with Google, we are entering, she explains, a regime of instrumentation with the aim of predicting, influencing, and controlling human behavior. Actually, we can find here a revitalization of behaviorism in a new form and anthropocentric approaches, which brings us in the troubles and crises we are finding ourselves right now in. In relation to education, I would describe them as forms of digital colonization of our learning practice. These are just examples of the possibilities and restraints, the inherent politics and contradictions of digital technologies and how they transform our practices of learning. Now, my point is the dialectics of digital connectedness require digital confinement in the practices of learning, not only because of the inherent politics and contradictoriness of digital devices and the need to relate to digital surveillance, manipulation, and control, but also because of the infiniteness of digital connectedness. If we just surrender to digital relationships, our practice of learning and our acts of learning get fragmented, disintegrated, and finally dissolve. The dialectics of digital connectedness require that we take our learning practice in our hands, that we relate to it, arrange and shape it, and give it a form which fits to the content of learning and the particular learning problems we are engaged in. There's a third major reason why digital confinement matters. This reason has to do with the specific characteristic of the act of learning. The core of the learning process consists of a movement of not yet knowing, but wanting to know. The process when we are struggling with the problems, trying to understand what we still not really understand. Holzkamp describes this as affinitive learning phase. It is a tentacular mode where we are trying to trace and grasp the problems in their affinities, kinship, and connection. Affinitive learning and tentacular thinking involves particular preconditions. It requires attention, presence, time, trust, the freedom to allow our thoughts to wander around, and of course, dialogue. Dialogue with myself, with others, and with all those things and materials related to the phenomena I'm trying to understand. Which opportunities do digital technologies offer for developing and enriching affinitive learning? In fact, this key mode of learning reveals the limits of digital devices. Not only can they hardly contribute to this process, but even more, they can undermine the required attention, calm, presence, and immediacy of dialogue. Therefore, expansive learning with digital technologies and engaging in tracing the meaning of the phenomena in their worldly connections requires also distancing from digital connectedness and a suspension of the online mode of being. To sum up, the various crises today are calling for an epistemic shift from knowing more and more about less and less towards an inquiry and understanding of the phenomena in their connections and what they mean for life on planet Earth. This involves a fundamental shift in our language of learning towards a problem understanding of learning as a worlding practice, based on a practice of learning which enables affinitive learning and tentacular thinking. Digital technologies give new possibilities to expand our practices of learning. However, they are inherently political and transform our practices of learning in contradictory ways. Therefore, They require to expand our imagination and to take the learning content and problems, as well as the preconditions of affinitive learning, as the central principles for arranging, shaping, and organizing our practices of learning.